So welcome, David. Nice to see you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Great to be here.
Thank you. With that, just very briefly to explain who I am, for those of you who don't know, I'm Paul Islands. I'm the VP of Life Sciences here at DocShifter. For those of you obviously connecting here on LinkedIn, there's obviously information about us online, but ultimately I lead the Life Sciences practice here at DocShifter. David, just quickly, if it's okay, if we could just start a little bit more broadly, for the audience who are perhaps unfamiliar with some of the terminology that you're likely to delve into more deeply, could you briefly explain what computer system validation, or CSV, and computer software assurance, or CSA, are exactly?
Sure. So I have a little image here that might help. I think the CSV, computer system validation area, is something most of the listeners are very painfully aware of. It's that traditional waterfall approach where we start with lengthy requirements workshops and sessions and translate that business knowledge into functional specifications, where we say how we're going to meet some of these requirements, and then physical system design specifications, precisely what functions we're going to call to do so. And then we capture all of that in various scripts of IQ, OQ, and PQ, and do extensive OQ, or operational qualification testing, to make sure every widget works and everything is described accurately, and all the negative testing that's performed to say that the wrong person can't log in and so forth. And then we take a subset of that and do extensive PQ testing. And all the while we're documenting everything, hence the mountain of paper that we're used to in the CSV world. So that's what we've been doing for decades. Now, CSA is a new bit of regulation from the FDA, but or I should say guidance, but it's not a new concept. What is new about it, though, is really focusing differently. Moving from a focus of compliance, which, do we have enough paper? Did we pass the weight test? To moving to, do we have confidence? Do we have assurance that this system is working? By doing more testing but producing less paper, which may seem a bit of a dichotomy, but that's the reality. We can leverage CSA to test more areas through unscripted testing, through ad hoc testing, by asking cognitive questions of, well, where could this break? What impact could a failure in the software have on patient safety, product quality, or data integrity? Those types of things. And so we're thinking more than documenting. So we're doing more testing and assuring a higher level of quality. We're also relying on previous work. That previous work could be from vendor solutions. Vendors have tested their software and provided those test results to us for review and perhaps inclusion, but we don't have to replicate work that's already been done. Conversely, we can look internally and say, have we tested something before, and can leverage that as well. So a reuse process, focusing much more on quality and less on paper production.
Great, thank you. Just maybe for some historical context, how's the validation process in life sciences specifically evolved over the years, especially maybe at least to begin with, where and how CSV fits into that history as well?
Sure. So both of us have a little bit of white or gray hair, whatever color we choose to call it. So probably before we got to that stage, if we think back to the late 90s, that's really where software validation took hold. So think back to life sciences. Documentum was the platform, right? So Documentum was first used in life sciences in 1992. And along around 97 was when our beloved biblical in nature guidance document called 21 CFR Part 11 came into being, right? Back in 1997. Now, that was brought to bear by the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH, but it applied to all of us, to CDER, so Center for Drug, and CBER, Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research. So we started having some software validation requirements to support e-signature and immutable records and so forth. And then in 99, the FDA said, okay, for CDER and CBER and CDRH, if they're doing clinical research, these are the steps you have to take to have to use software in clinical trials. So instead of just paper case report forms and adding it up with a calculator, if you're going to use software, these are some of the processes we have to go through. So that's where we started. And then about 5 or 6 years later, in 2004, there was analysis done on those warning letters, those things that as manufacturers we don't ever want to see or hear about. But they looked back historically over the 5 years since 1997, since these rules were put in place, and found that over 20 warning letters mentioned or were based on issues with computer software validation. So obviously, we still had a lot to learn, but that's where it started. Now, in parallel, the industry was saying, how do we deal with the health authorities, FDA, EMA, and others in their regulations for what we need to do for process manufacturing, for producing the product? And so an organization was formed around good automated manufacturing practice that we now affectionately call GAMP. It's not a regulator-led organization, although they work very, very close together. That organization started way back in 91 with its first regulations in 94. So somewhat parallel to what the FDA was doing. And here we have an industry focus looking at it. And then GAMP 5, the latest incarnation, came out as recently as 2008 with a second edition last year in 2022 that also spoke to validation, but at a risk-based approach. We'll talk more about that as we go on. So it's been a long legacy. Most of my career is validation, and FDA has focus on CSV in that world.
Okay. And what were some of the limitations and maybe challenges with the CSV approach that kind of led to the realization that there was a need for some new perspective, new approach?
Yeah, well, great question. So I imagine there's a number of us on the call today that have uttered the phrase, does it pass the weight test? Particularly when it comes to validation. I know in my early consulting days, we'd have 3-ring binders that if it didn't feel heavy enough, we didn't test enough. And that was the measure. And so we were focusing on being compliant. If it wasn't written down, it didn't happen. And we had to turn over to our clients, to our IT quality teams, binders, reams and reams of paper that proved we tested something in the system, right? And so that testing, writing all those OQ scripts, executing all of that, transferring it over to PQ World, et cetera, has become a huge burden on the industry. And even to this day, I think as we look at innovative technologies, we see a reticence in life sciences. I mean, years ago, I saw a Forrester report that said life sciences was on a scale, it was the 17th least innovative industry, that there were 16 other industries more able to adapt to change and accept change and embrace it and leverage it than life sciences. And we think about human life. That says something not very positive about the situation we're in. And that translated into things where validation became such a costly burden and time burden that companies were reticent to move forward. And we saw examples where validation would be 2 times the cost of implementation. And just a few months ago, I was speaking to someone in industry who shared that they were doing a very small project with their Viva Vault platform. They were connecting one vault to another. And it's prepackaged software that needs to be configured and implemented and a few design elements done. But it took only 6 weeks to do that implementation, but it took an additional 8 weeks to validate it. And so, Houston, we've had a problem if that's the situation, right? We need to fix that problem. And so that's the burden of validation. But the other side of that is the only thing that's constant is change. And our validation approaches need to evolve with our implementation approaches. We now have agile methodologies. We go into scrums with a list of backlog items and we try to tackle 50 of them, but we only get 35 of them. Well, how do we adjust our validation processes to adapt to that? Or another example is now Pharma 4.0. We're moving into digital world, mobile apps and innovative automated manufacturing concepts and other digital initiatives. Our validation, our testing methodologies have to evolve with that. And CSV wasn't prepared to do so. So that's why a change was certainly warranted.
All right. And I know obviously the FDA have often kind of guided or shaped some of these processes. How have they guided or shaped the validation processes specifically in life sciences?
Well, I think there's a couple interesting elements. If we think about validation itself, way back when I was still in school, 1979, let's turn the clocks back. That's when the FDA started using the concept of validation. proving that process manufacturing was producing the products, producing the pills or whatever, the way it was intended. And that evolved as software evolved. So, Commodore 64 was how I got my computer science degree. Fortunately, I don't think any pharmaceutical products were made with the Commodore 64, or I hope not. But at the time, as I mentioned, 1997 and 21 CFR Part 11 compliance, that biblical nature, that gold standard of a document that we lived and breathed on, and used that phrase too many syllables too many times over the last couple decades. But if you really look at the specification at that entry in the Code of Federal Regulations, the preamble to it is very eye-opening, because I don't think many of us, I know I didn't until I researched it recently, really embraced that statement. And it said back in 97 that the agency, the FDA, really believes that within the realm of Part 11, so within these strict guidelines, that firms have the flexibility to adjust the extent and stringency of controls based on any factors that they choose, which means we were given license to change this validation burden way back in 97. So the FDA had that forethought, just like our forefathers did in the US Constitution, and other countries did as well, that change happens and we have to evolve. And so they put that in place. Now, government change takes time, but CDER, CBER, CDRH are working with GAMP and embracing this risk-based approach for many, many years. Now they're getting a guidance that is finally catching up.
And was there like a catalyst? Was there a specific FDA assessment or event that was like the tipping point, that led to the creation of CSA in the first place?
Yes, I believe there was a significant one. And again, back to CDRH, the case for quality, a case for quality initiative happened back in 2011. So about 10 years after the clock started on validation, the medical device industry suffered a significant issue, particularly in the radiology area. There was a device radiology machine that the software wasn't doing as expected. And for fact, for some patients, it caused 1,000% more radiation than was requested, and causing obviously fatalities and other injuries. And so the FDA said, we've got to do something differently. We've got to improve the quality. And note, the initiative is called the case for quality, not the case for compliance. And so as part of that, they started looking at bringing all the stakeholders together, the manufacturers, the sponsors, et cetera, even the patients, and saying, how do we improve this process? And developing a maturity model. How do we get to where we need to be, where our product quality is consistent and predictable? And how do we analyze the outcomes to make sure that we are delivering the product quality that we need to? And so I think that was really the trigger, where FDA said we need to do things differently. And so did the industry outside of regulators. So the GAMP5 model of validation came out, the guidance from that perspective, not a regulator perspective, but from an industry-based guidance that came out in 2008. So a few years later, there was guidance to say, let's start rethinking how we approach validation.
So I guess the big question is how does CSA differ from, in practical terms, how does it differ from CSV, and what are some of the main benefits to CSA over CSV approach?
So let's take a look quickly at how we even do CSA. How do we do a risk-based approach? So I have a couple illustrations to walk you through that. So let's take a look at this first slide. And this is looking at the system level itself. So assessing this piece of software that we're about to implement, whether it's vault registrations, whether it's a LIMS system, whether it's a document management system, whatever it is. So let's look at the y-axis first, the technical risk. So you see there's numbers 1 through 4. So at the bottom level of that, we assess our system to say, well, if it's just infrastructure, it's just a level 1. Let's skip up to 3 and say at level 3, that's your Viva Vault registrations. That's SaaS software or other implementations of software that are configured, not customized. So they've been tested and working from the vendor. You configure them for your personal needs, but they're still within the realm of what the vendor did. At the top level, 4, that's the medical device itself. All right. So the operational risk then is we're looking at operating the software. What impact does it have to patients? So number one, there's no patient impact, no safety impact to patients. Again, skipping to level 3. Now we're looking at a moderate impact, like implementing QMS software. So let's say we're implementing Vault QMS software. That is a 3 on technical risk and a 3 on operational risk, and that falls squarely in the orange box. What does that mean? That means if you look there on the right in the legend, we can do, based on this system level assessment, risk-based validation. Now, the red areas, if you cross into those, if you're doing medical devices and medical device software or fully customized software that has a direct impact to patients, then that's traditional CSV. That's the red box. And conversely, and this may make heads explode, but if you're in the white areas, there's no validation needed, which is a thought we never had since Part 11 compliance.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
So
go ahead.
Sorry, please go ahead, David. No.
So this is the first step. So I was going to go into the next step. So if we can show the next slide. So now we know that what the system is all about. And so it's a level 3 on both axes, let's say. So now we look at the processes within this system. So now we're looking at a collection of processes. So in the case of a QMS, it could be audit management, deviation management. It could be e-signature or audit trail or document workflow, a grouping of processes, not individual requirements. And so we look at these and say, again, on the y-axis, the risk severity. So again, is there any impact to patients? So no impact and high impact to patients. And then if we look at the probability of failure, so is it likely to break? Well, out of the box that we haven't touched is very low. Highly configured is more likely human error will cause issues of failure. So again, we have the same colors, the same impact. Red means go back to CSV. Yellow means we can do risk-based. White means you don't even need to do it. So then we take that number that we get out of this risk class and apply it to the y-axis in the second chart to ask one final important question. What do we perceive the detectability of failure to be? Will we know we have a problem? So, like Houston, we've had a problem. They knew they had an issue. They could detect it. So it had a high level of detectability. However, the risk class said that we don't have to worry about it because there's low patient impact. However, if we don't think we'll be able to detect the issue and there's high level of patient risk, then again, we need to be much more rigorous documenting our analysis. So does that make sense? Let's assume it does, those 3 steps. So let's see it all come together. Sorry, Paul, I did ask a question, but let's go to just summarize it in this last slide, just to bring it all together. So here we are. I mentioned Vault quality. Let's assume this is Vault EQMS perspective here. And what we're doing is we're looking at a group of processes, like I mentioned, deviation management, audit management, complaint management, etc. And we've looked at these various things. So our risk severity, our probability of failure, our ability to detect failures, and then that ultimate risk priority, the x-axis of the previous chart. And so what this is showing us is for deviation management, we haven't done anything there. We haven't configured anything. We know if we have a problem, so the risk is very low. And notice what CSA tells us in this context is we can do unscripted or ad hoc testing, which is blasphemy to most IT quality people. However, that's the case when we're focused on quality and critical thinking. Audit management, we have a different situation. We have vendor materials, test materials that we can leverage to prove that audit management works. So we don't even need to test that section. But as it said in the notes above, our complaint management piece has been highly configured. Human error has crept in, so we're going to do standard scripted testing on that. And product containment, we can do something a little different, a checklist-based testing. We don't need screenshots, we don't need double signatures, etc., but we're going to script out a little bit of testing. So what does this tell us overall? Not the individual things are important, but it says that we have reduced our standard scripted testing by at least 50%, 70%. And yes, you're documenting that you've done some unscripted or ad hoc testing here or there. There are ways to capture that you've done this. You can't just say, "Oh, yep, I've done this, etc." But it's not a full-blown OQ or PQ script. So I hope that explains the difference from CSA and CSV.
Very clear. Thank you. And I'd like to kind of get to like some of the future implications and challenges, but maybe briefly, could you talk a little bit about the FDA's perspective on, their stance on CSA, how it affects life sciences companies' approach to validation now?
Sure. So let me use an analogy of another initiative in the life sciences space, IDMP, Identification of Medicinal Products. And I would say, like IDMP, we need to start focusing, and the FDA is encouraging us to start focusing and shifting our focus rather from compliance to quality. IDMP is about improving quality. Yes, you have to be compliant, and the EMA's target operating model tells us when we have to submit and how to submit ultimately, et cetera. But the ultimate goal is to improve our overall knowledge base and our product quality out the door into the patient's hands. So in a similar way on the validation side, let's shift away from paper and reams of paper to focusing on quality. And however, the opposite of IDMP is that I think, as Steve Gens and Associates tells us, only a small percentage of life sciences companies are physically acting on that shift and implementing IDMP support today. Why? Because they're waiting for guidelines to change and be approved. Unlike IDMP, this is real now. This isn't new guidance. This is a way of thinking that should be established now. We were given the green light 25 plus years ago by that preamble in Part 11 compliance to adjust as needed, and CSA is right within that realm. So, I would say the FDA is encouraging all of us to establish that risk-based approach, define critical thinking, and then start executing on it now. Don't wait for guidance.
And with the CSA approach in the picture now, where do you see the future of validation in the life sciences industry? Where do you see it heading?
So I think we're going to see a shift in a number of things. I mean, the old way for the last 20 plus years was, people show up, whether internal resources or external consultants, to write a lot of scripts and then customize those. We may have bought a set of accelerators from our vendor as a starting point and then rejigger, configure what changed based on the client's implementation, but we still went through the same process. And what I think we'll see more of in the future is the vendors being more aggressive, more a part of the solution, providing testing documentation, providing that element of reuse that enables a much more rapid turnaround of implementing updates to their software and so forth. And so I think we'll see a change in our vendors providing a lot more of that to us. And I also think we'll see more third party. I know I plan to do some of this as well, where third party enactment or involvement, like we did in the early days of Documentum, where instead of going to Pleasanton, California to do a site audit of Documentum, you went to ABC Company, and for $25,000 you got a copy of their site audit that you could use and put in your documentation. Well, now I think we'll see more of a commodity approach that says, well, we've audited this vendor and we have seen and looked into their development practices and their test results, and you don't have to test X, Y, and Z. We never, ever, ever want to test Documentum login again, and here's why, and make it available. So I think that'll be a big shift as well in this process. And I think we'll see then a packaging of some pre-validation packages as we go forward also.
The challenges that you see as companies transition from CSV to CSA, kind of what challenges have you seen, or are they likely, might they face, and how might they overcome some of those challenges?
So, the three most important words in real estate are location, location, location. And I think the biggest issue in CSV is going to be people, people, people. This isn't rocket science. This isn't like implementing IDMP, which is a huge shift at the end of the day. This is just critically thinking about the process and what can break and how, and letting go of passing the weight test and saying we don't have to produce 500,000 pages of paper to say we've tested everything, but we can look more critically at the areas we need to test. So I think that's going to be critical to be able to transition to CSV, is to get our culture there. And then secondly, to get some of these assets from vendors and the like to help leverage that previous work.
Great, thanks. And I mean, that's been all very interesting. And just at the end, maybe just to kind of wrap up before we hopefully have a couple of minutes for some questions at the end, do you have some key takeaways for life sciences companies still operating mostly under CSV, which is still a large portion of everybody? What would be that your key piece of advice that, you know, as they consider transitioning to CSA? Do you have some kind of key takeaways at the end?
Sure. Great. Let me show you one more slide that'll help with that. Interesting anecdote about this slide. I work with a very talented head of marketing who's very good at graphical design, much more than I am. And you notice there's some words out of the picture here, which I figured he would probably want to change. And I'm delighted that he didn't, because it emphasizes the message here. CSV on the left, that V model, but it's also turning over the pyramid in the sense that Documentum was king, the gold standard. And there was very little space in the CSV world for critical thinking. Whereas if we look at the CSA approach, there's very little space for documentation. Yes, we need some. And if it's a medical device, a medical device software, you're using a ton of documentation. Or if it's custom software, you're still going to do a lot of documentation. But in other areas, we can focus more on that baseline of critical thinking. And I think the key takeaways are best quoted from an interview that Cisco Vicente was quoted in 2022, so very recently. So he is the program director of the Case for Quality for CDRH. And his view of the Case for Quality is that it's a bridge to bridge the gap between technology and compliance, to enable life sciences companies to take advantage of things like cloud computing, mobile devices, validation management software, all of those things. But there were three key elements. Number one, this is not new regulation. The regulation fits right within Part 11 and everything else that's come before it. What this guidance does is provide clarity on defining risk and how life sciences are enabled to take risks and make risk-based decisions and assess it. And then also simultaneously revise FDA's view from inspectors, auditors, et cetera, on record keeping. We don't need tomes of paper. We just need to focus on quality.
Thank you. Maybe with that, thanks, David. I think it's been very interesting. I know I've learned quite a few new sort of aspects here as well about sort of the CSA approach in particular. And maybe just a time for a couple of questions at the end. For those that we don't get to, this session stays live in LinkedIn. So if anybody's asked questions, we will respond to them in the chat. So if you refer back here to the same link you used to connect, you'll actually see us answering questions in there even after the session finishes, because we won't get to all of them. But a couple that did come in, you mentioned about CDRH. Is CSA limited to medical devices because it's labeled as a CDRH initiative?
When I read the guidance document in September of 2022, my first reaction was, oh, does this really apply to my clients who are drug product or biologic manufacturers? And it absolutely is not limited to drug device or medical device. It is applicable to all three of those that I mentioned, and perhaps more. It's as equally applicable to drug product and biologic manufacturing as it is medical device manufacturing. The rules change based on the risk profile of the software you're implementing, but the applicability is the same.
Is there anything that you see as being missing? A question came in saying, are we missing anything so far? Do you see anything that's missing from the CSA guidance as you know it and understand it right now, to fulfill some of the requirements, some of the things that were wrong, if you like, with CSV, or the limitations?
Okay.
Anything,
yeah. Well, to be honest, CSA, given the newness of the draft guidance documents, what we have evaluated, and we built a solution to support it, I haven't really seen something missing as much as the cultural shift to accept the answers given. And that I don't think could be in the guidance. I think that's going to take some time. For the longest time, the whole thing is built on my example was of processes and process categories. I'm still struggling, to be honest, to get my head around what a process is, what a collection of requirements that are boiled up into a process is defined as, and how to implement that. I wouldn't blame that on CSA guidance. I think that's more just cultural understanding.
All right, thank you. And maybe just one final question, and then we'll wrap up if that's okay. And for those other questions that are in there, we will get back to you afterwards. Are screenshots the only acceptable evidence? Is there any other form, or are screenshots really the only acceptable way of proving that you've tested something, for example?
So, just like winding down windows on a car, I work with people that have never wound down a window on a car, or never hung from a 20-foot coiled telephone cord in another room so their parents didn't hear them speaking to a boyfriend or girlfriend or what have you. Screenshots are in that same ilk, in my opinion. And I think, in the words of Cisco and others, that the use of that ad nauseum evidence is really not providing that much value at the end of the day. Yes, we have to have some documentation, but there is a balance. And remember, my third takeaway was revise FDA's thinking on record keeping and defining enough, what is enough. And so our push and our approach to CSA is to reduce that to an absolute bare minimum.
Perfect. Thank you, David. Thanks very much. And I really appreciate your time. It's been very interesting. As I said, just to repeat, this session is actually recorded. So the moment we kind of close here, within a few minutes, you should be able to access the recording online. So if you wanted to share the link with anybody, they could obviously look at this session as well and provide comments. If you did ask any questions, you could always look back here, because we will answer them in text, because we don't know necessarily who you are or have your email addresses. So we will answer the questions in line here as well. So with that, thank you, David. Appreciate your time. Excited about the future validation, because anything that can kind of reduce that burden, I'm sure everybody's going to appreciate. So thanks again, and have a good afternoon and rest of your day, everybody. And thanks again, David. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.